What kind of shepherd walks calmly toward death in chains and names a church meant to live forever still there? Welcome, dear friends, to St. Lives. Wherever you are listening tonight, in a quiet bedroom or late-night kitchen, share your place with me, subscribe, and let us begin now. This is the story of Ignatius of Antioch, bishop and martyr, who carried a trembling flock, wrote blazing letters while bound in iron, and first called the Church Catholic as he walked willingly toward Christ in Rome to his death. From that opening hush, we turn now to Antioch, where the first light of the Church had already learned to live under shadow, and where an old shepherd named Ignatius carried the faith like a lamp cupped against the wind. Antioch of Syria was a city that never quite slept, a place where caravans groaned into markets at dawn and ships whispered along the Orontes River, bringing spices, philosophies, rumors, and gods from every corner of the empire. Its streets were loud with languages, its temples crowded with incense, and its politics sharp as a blade. Yet somewhere within that restless noise, among workshops and narrow alleys and simple homes, a quieter community gathered before sunrise to pray in the name of Jesus Christ. They were not many. They did not announce themselves. They were men and women who had heard the gospel from travelers, from disciples of the apostles, from neighbors whose eyes had changed after encountering the risen Lord. In Antioch, believers had first been called Christians, not as a compliment, but as a label of difference, a way to say, these people belong to another king. To be a Christian here was to belong to a family that was both tender and hunted, a family that warmed itself around the Eucharist while learning to watch the door. Ignatius had grown old in this city. The details of his youth do not come to us like a clear portrait, but more like a silhouette at dusk. We know almost nothing of his parents, his first teachers, or the exact moment he was drawn into the Christian way. The church of his time was not a place of public records or polished stories. It was a living memory passed in whispers from heart to heart, shaped by risk and love. Some later voices would call him a disciple of the Apostle John. Others would say he had learned from Peter or Paul, and perhaps in some manner he had, if not by sitting at their feet, then by drinking from the stream they had set flowing. But even if no apostle ever placed a hand on his shoulder, Ignatius belonged to their generation of spirit, formed close enough to the beginnings that the air still smelled of the upper room, of Galilee, of the first Pentecost. He was a child of the church while she was still young, still surprised by her own existence, still learning how to survive in a world that did not understand her. By the time we meet him in the light of history, Ignatius is Bishop of Antioch. The word bishop in those early years did not mean a man of comfort, nor one surrounded by ceremony. It meant a guardian, a servant, a father who carried the wounds and hopes of his people as if they were stitched into his own skin. He stood at the center of a community that could scatter at any moment. One day, they might be praying in peace, and the next day someone might vanish into prison, or a neighbor might betray them for a handful of coins, or a local magistrate might decide it was time to make an example. The empire was not always cruel in the same way or in the same place, yet the unpredictability was its own cruelty, like thunder that may strike without warning. To lead under such pressure required a steadiness that could not be acted. It had to be rooted in God. Ignatius was that kind of steady. Those who knew him remembered a warmth that did not soften truth, and a firmness that did not harden into pride. When he spoke in the gatherings, he did not speak as if he owned the faith, but as if he was owned by it. He had seen enough of the world to know that human hearts are easily scattered, especially when fear is near. So he labored quietly to keep the flock together. Antioch was not only threatened from outside, but also strained from within. The early church was a miracle, yet like all miracles carried in fragile hands, it needed care. Some believers were Jews who had found Christ as the fulfillment of Israel. Others were Gentiles who had come from temples and idols, and everything about their habits and assumptions was different. Even in prayer, their accents of soul could clash. There were questions with no easy answers, and temptations to separate into smaller, safer groups. A frightened community can mistake division for protection. Ignatius knew this. He knew that Rome might kill the body, but division could kill the heart. So his days were filled with listening, teaching, mending. He visited the sick and the poor, not as a figure above them, but as one among them. He sat with widows who had lost husbands to disease, to accident, sometimes to persecution, and he reminded them that Christ was not absent in grief, but dwelling in it. He met young converts who burned with zeal and gently taught them patience, because holiness is not only a flame, but a slow, steady light. He spoke to the wealthy who were confused about how to live their faith without drawing dangerous attention, and he urged them to be generous because love has its own courage. He spoke to those who feared martyrdom and did not shame them. He had no interest in heroic performances. He simply wanted them to stay near Christ, near the sacraments, near one another, because that closeness was the only shelter that could not be burned down. There were moments, too, when he himself must have felt tired. An old man does not carry a hunted church without sometimes waking in the night with the ache of it. Yet his fatigue seems to have deepened his prayer, not weakened it. In Antioch, the Eucharist was not an ornament of devotion. It was the heartbeat. They gathered around bread and wine that had become the Lord's body and blood, and they did so with trembling reverence, because they believed they were touching eternity with ordinary hands. Ignatius loved the Eucharist like a man who knows he cannot live without it. In that hidden room where believers murmured the prayers of the Lord, he saw the church not as a human club, but as Christ alive in his people. When he lifted his eyes from the altar to their faces, he did not see a crowd. He saw a body, one body, bound together not by convenience but by grace. It is in this context that the true shape of his soul becomes clear. Ignatius was not aiming to build a personal legacy. He was aiming to keep the church faithful. He did not seek danger, but he did not flee it either. He was not reckless, but he was not ruled by survival. His faith had matured beyond the stage of asking whether suffering would come, and had moved into the deeper question of how to remain loving when suffering does come. His prayer was likely full of simple petitions, not for himself, but for his people. Lord, keep them one. Lord, keep them near you. Lord, do not let fear scatter them. And Antioch itself pressed these prayers into him. The city offered everything that could dazzle a human life: statues lit by torches at night, theaters roaring with applause, debates that filled public squares, riches that tempted the ambitious, pleasures that promised to forget death. Yet Ignatius watched all this with the calm of a man who had found a different treasure. He knew the empire was mighty, yes, but he also knew its might was temporary. Its monuments would one day crumble. Its emperors would pass like smoke. What mattered was the kingdom that had already begun in Christ, a kingdom hidden like seed in soil, but unstoppable. Still, none of this removed the danger. If anything, his clarity made him more aware of what was at stake. He was guiding a flock that could be slaughtered, and he could not shield them with walls or armies. He could only shield them by nourishing their faith and binding them in love. There is a special sorrow for a shepherd who knows he will not be able to spare his sheep from wolves. Yet there is also a special grace when that shepherd trusts the true shepherd more than his own strength. Ignatius lived in that trust. So part one of his story is not the clang of chains yet, nor the roar of crowds, but the quiet life before the road, the slow forming of a martyr in the soil of ordinary ministry. It is the picture of an elderly bishop walking the streets of Antioch with the weight of souls on his shoulders, yet with a tenderness still intact. It is the sound of early morning prayers rising like breath in cold air. It is the taste of Eucharistic bread shared in secrecy, and the steady hand of a pastor who keeps saying, "Stay together, stay near Christ, stay in peace," even when peace feels fragile. The empire beyond the walls may have seemed invincible, and the church within them may have seemed small, but Ignatius had learned to measure life by a different scale. He knew that a single act of faith can outlast 1,000 statues, and that unity in Christ is stronger than any sword. And so the shepherd stands at the edge of history, not knowing how near the storm truly is, yet already living as one who belongs to God more than to fear. The storm does not arrive all at once, but in years of strain that shape a soul, and so we remain in Antioch a little longer, watching how Ignatius learned to carry the church through ordinary days that were never entirely ordinary. If part of his greatness lies in the letters he would later write, and in the death he would later embrace, another part lies in the hidden patience of his shepherding, the slow and faithful work of guiding people who were trying to love God while keeping their children safe, trying to worship with gladness while knowing at any moment a knock might come at the door. Antioch was not only a city of merchants and marble, it was a city of gossip and suspicion, and Christians were still new enough, strange enough, that their quiet meetings could be mistaken for shadows. Their refusal to honor the gods could be called treason. Their talk of a crucified king could be mocked as madness. Most believers lived in a careful balance, speaking softly in public, but burning brightly in private. Ignatius knew this carefulness, and he did not scold it. He had lived long enough to understand that courage can look like many things, and that sometimes the bravest act is simply to keep showing up to prayer when fear would rather keep you home. In those years, he spent much of his time strengthening the invisible threads that held the community together. The church did not have grand buildings. She had houses with lamplight, courtyards with worn stones, a few safe rooms where the faithful could gather in the early dark before work began. In such places, Ignatius presided over the breaking of bread, and he did so as if the whole world depended on it, because in truth, for that small flock, the world did depend on it. The Eucharist was their anchor. They believed, as the apostles had taught, that this was not a symbol only, but the true gift of Christ, his body offered, his blood poured out, his life placed in their hands as food. When Ignatius spoke of the altar, he did not speak as a philosopher weighing ideas, but as a man who had tasted the sweetness of God and could not forget it. The Eucharist taught them that Christ was not a distant memory but a living presence, and it also taught them that they were one body. You cannot share one bread and pretend to be strangers. So Ignatius returned again and again to this simple lesson, that communion with Christ must become communion with one another. There were plenty of reasons for division to tempt them. Antioch's believers were a living mixture of backgrounds, some shaped by the law and the prophets, others shaped by Greco-Roman ways, and even after baptism, the old habits of soul do not vanish overnight. Some of the Jewish Christians feared that Gentile converts would dilute the faith, forgetting that Christ had fulfilled the law not to shrink it, but to open it. Some Gentile Christians, eager to be free from idols, worried that Jewish customs were a step backward. Ignatius listened, and he taught gently. He reminded them that the gospel was not a ship for one people only, but a harbor for the whole human family. He spoke of Christ as the new center around which all could gather, not erasing their histories, but healing them, making them part of one story. When arguments rose in the community, he did not answer with anger. He answered with the steady rhythm of a father who refuses to let siblings become enemies. He also had to guard his flock from the teachings that sounded spiritual, but weakened the heart of faith. In those early years, certain voices began to spread ideas that Christ was only a spirit wearing a human mask, or that his suffering was an illusion, or that the Eucharist was a mere sign like any other. To modern ears, such debates might sound distant, but for the early church they were urgent, because they shaped how people endured suffering and how they loved one another. If Christ had not truly taken flesh, then human pain could be dismissed as unimportant. If Christ had not truly suffered, then martyrdom was not a sharing in his life, but a pointless cruelty. If the Eucharist was not truly his body, then communion was not the pulse of the Church, but a pleasant ritual. Ignatius saw through these dangers with a kind of pastoral instinct. He was not hunting controversy. He was defending tenderness. He knew that a faith emptied of Christ's real humanity would become cold, and that a faith emptied of real sacrament would become thin, unable to nourish people when the world pressed down on them. So he taught the truth in a way that was firm, but never theatrical. Christ was born. Christ suffered. Christ rose. Christ gives himself to you. Stay close to that, and you will not lose your way. And amid all this teaching, there was the quieter labor of forming leaders, men whom the community could trust when Ignatius was not present. Deacons who would serve the poor, priests who would help carry the load of prayer and catechesis, elders who could steady the anxious. We should imagine Ignatius in long conversations, asking questions, listening for humility, looking for men who loved God more than power. The early church could not afford shepherds who sought status. A bishop who chose the wrong helpers could tear a community apart. So Ignatius was careful. The best care often looks slow from the outside, but inside it is prayerful vigilance. Yet perhaps the heaviest part of his ministry was not theological, but emotional, the steady work of keeping hope alive. Persecution in Antioch came like weather, not always raging, but always possible. 1 week might pass without trouble, and then a rumor would spread that Christians were to be arrested, and people would grow pale, hiding sacred books, warning friends, holding their children close. Families learned how to speak about martyrdom without frightening the young, how to honor the fallen without feeding despair. Ignatius walked with them through these cycles of calm and dread. Sometimes he must have sat beside a man whose brother had been taken, or a mother whose daughter had vanished, and he would have found words that did not pretend pain was small. He likely spoke of Christ's nearness in suffering, of the cross not as an idea, but as a place where God joined himself to human anguish. He did not say, "Do not be afraid," as if fear were sinful in itself. He said, "Do not let fear make you abandon love. Fear can visit, yes, but love must remain the master of the house." There is a quiet heroism in that kind of guidance. It is not the heroism of a single dramatic moment. It is the heroism of showing the same faithful face day after day, of not giving in to bitterness, of remaining gentle while the world behaves brutally. Ignatius had every reason to become hard. Age, pressure, disappointment, and danger can harden a man. But his faith had made him more human, not less. He treated the weak patiently. He treated the proud honestly. He treated the fearful with mercy. In doing so, he built a culture of trust, and trust is what allows a persecuted community to flourish rather than collapse inward. Sometimes, too, he allowed himself to reflect on the mystery of God's timing. He had seen the church grow from a small seed into a wider vine, spreading from Jerusalem into Syria, Asia, Greece, Italy, and beyond. He had seen converts come in tears, as if rescued from drowning. He had seen the gospel change old lives, soften cruel hearts, make enemies into brothers. And yet he had also seen betrayals, backsliding, and the slow grinding of imperial power. It would have been easy to ask, why does God allow this? But Ignatius seems to have carried a different question in his heart, a question that is more like prayer than complaint. How can we love more deeply inside this trial? How can we be faithful without becoming frightened into smallness? How can we be one body when the world wants to scatter us? These were not abstract questions for him. They were daily bread. And in the center of those questions, always, was Christ. Not a distant Christ of theory, but a Christ who had loved first, who had entered flesh, who had allowed violence to touch him without allowing hatred to rule him. Ignatius encouraged his people to look at Christ not only for comfort, but for pattern. The Lord had not fled suffering, and neither should they flee love. The Lord had remained faithful to the Father, and so should they. The Lord had gathered disciples into one table, and so should they gather into one church. When Ignatius prayed, he prayed like a man leaning into that pattern, measuring his own heartbeat against the heartbeat of his Savior. So Antioch, during these years, becomes a kind of quiet workshop of holiness. We should imagine Ignatius as a steady presence in the city, a bishop moving among ordinary homes, his robe perhaps worn, his face lined, his voice calm, and the community drawing strength from him the way a traveler draws warmth from a fire. No one in those days knew precisely what was coming, not the believers, not Ignatius himself. But God was already shaping him for the road ahead. Every dispute he healed, every Eucharist he celebrated, every tear he dried, every warning he gave against false teaching, every prayer he whispered in the dark, was slowly turning him into a man who would one day speak with astonishing clarity while iron bit into his wrists. And perhaps Ignatius sensed this in a quiet way, not the details, but the direction, as if his soul could feel the tide pulling him toward a larger witness. Yet he did not rush it. He kept doing the work of love in the place where God had planted him, trusting that when the hour came, grace would be enough. In the hush of Antioch, Ignatius learns that love must be stronger than terror, and that unity must be guarded like a treasure, for soon the world will test both more fiercely than anyone yet realizes. As the empire hardened, so did the tests of those who followed Christ, and the quiet workshop of holiness in Antioch began to feel the weight of a wider world pressing in from every side. It is easy, from far away, to imagine the Roman Empire as a single unbroken machine, always cruel in the same way, always watching every corner. But in Ignatius's day, the empire was vast and uneven, more like a sea than a wall, calm in one region and stormy in another, peaceful one season and suddenly violent the next. This unpredictability was part of what made life so anxious for early Christians. There were places where believers could live quietly for years, and there were places where a whisper could become an accusation, and an accusation could become death. Antioch sat in the crossroads of these currents, too important to ignore, too exposed to feel safe. The emperor then was Trajan, a soldier in temperament, Admired by many as a restorer of Roman strength and order, his reign brought roads, aqueducts, and the steady tightening of discipline across provinces. He was not a man known for personal hatred of Christians, but he was a man who believed that unity of the empire required unity of worship, of civic loyalty, of public rights. Rome's gods were not only religious figures, they were political glue, binding the many peoples of the empire into a common habit of reverence. To refuse sacrifice was not seen as a private spiritual choice, but as a dangerous sign of disloyalty. Christians did not burn incense to the emperor. They would not call Caesar Lord, because they had already given that word to Christ. They would pray for the emperor, yes, but they would not worship him. To Roman ears, this sounded stubborn, ungrateful, even rebellious. And so the empire's policy toward Christians, while not always systematic, was clear in its direction. If they were accused and would not recant, they were to be punished. If they denied Christ, they were to be spared. The empire's logic was simple. Conformity brings peace, refusal brings disorder. Trajan's own thinking was shown in a quiet but chilling exchange of letters with Pliny the Younger, a governor in Bithynia. Pliny did not know exactly how to handle Christians, and he asked the emperor for guidance. Trajan answered in a way that reveals the temper of the age. Christians were not to be hunted down in a public sweep, but if they were brought forward and proved stubborn, they must be made an example. It was a policy that could look mild on paper and yet crush a community in reality, because it placed Christians under constant threat while allowing Rome to claim moderation. It meant that no Christian could feel fully secure. Their safety depended not on law, but on the mood of neighbors, on local officials, on a sudden rumor, on the whim of a magistrate who wanted to show zeal for tradition. In such a climate, fear came not only from what was happening, but from what could happen any day. Antioch heard these imperial currents as one hears distant thunder. The city was full of soldiers and administrators traveling between the eastern provinces. News moved quickly in taverns and marketplaces, and Christians listened with a special kind of attention, because their lives were tied to these rumors. A report of executions in one province could make a whole neighborhood in Antioch grow silent. A story of a bishop arrested elsewhere could send a chill through the presbyters who served under Ignatius. Yet there was also another kind of news that moved among believers. News not of terror, but of courage. They heard of martyrs who had died peacefully, of young women who had refused to deny Christ, of old men who had been thrown to beasts while praying. These stories were not told to glorify suffering for its own sake. They were told as reminders that grace could hold a human heart steady, even when the body shook with fear. The church lived between these two currents, dread and hope, the threat of Rome and the promise of Christ. And it was in this narrow passage that Ignatius guided his people. One can imagine Ignatius receiving visitors from other communities, travelers who brought both the scars of persecution and the bright calm of faith. Perhaps a merchant from Asia Minor arrived with trembling hands, telling of Christians tried before a governor. Perhaps a deacon from a nearby city came seeking advice after a local outbreak of violence. Antioch's church was not isolated. It was part of a growing yet fragile body stretching across the empire, a body that was learning, in real time, how to remain one under pressure. Ignatius understood that Antioch could not think only of itself. The suffering of one church was the suffering of all. The courage of one church was a gift to all. He spoke of this often. And it is likely that even before his letters, his preaching carried the seed of what he would later call Catholic, the sense of a church not bounded by city walls, but gathered around Christ across the whole world. Still, The pressure of empire had practical consequences. Christians had to decide how to live in society without betraying the faith. Some were artisans who belonged to guilds that opened meetings by honoring pagan gods. Some were servants whose masters expected them to pour libations at household rituals. Some were soldiers or officials whose careers depended on public sacrifice. Each life was a tangle of loyalties, and each believer had to untangle them with humility and fierce conscience. Ignatius did not give simplistic answers. The early church was still learning the difference between compromise and prudence. He urged them to avoid needless provocation, but he also urged them not to soften the gospel into something that could fit comfortably inside Rome. There is a careful line between being wise as serpents and becoming ashamed of the Lord. Ignatius's task was to keep his flock on that line without pushing them into panic or pride. There were also the temptations that fear brings inside the soul. When danger grows, some people become reckless, wanting martyrdom like a trophy, forgetting that suffering is not a performance. Others become cautious to the point of quiet denial, telling themselves that silence is harmless, that small offerings to idols do not matter, that Christ will understand. Both extremes threatened the church's heart. Ignatius steered between them. He honored the martyrs, but he did not romanticize death. He encouraged courage, but he did not scorn weakness. His aim was not to manufacture heroes, but to nurture saints, people who loved Christ steadily, whether their days were long or short. He reminded them that fidelity could look like dying for Christ, yes, but it could also look like living for Him, day after day, under suspicion, without bitterness, without hatred. What mattered was not the shape of the trial, but the shape of the love inside it. As months passed and the imperial climate tightened, Antioch began to feel more openly watched. Christians noticed the way conversations fell silent when they entered public spaces. They heard the edge in certain voices. They sensed that their neighbors were being taught to view them as a threat to civic peace. In a city proud of its loyalty to Rome, deviation was not tolerated for long. And because Antioch was large and influential, it was also a place where Rome would want to demonstrate control. If an example were to be made in the East, Antioch was a stage ready for it. Ignatius could not stop that tide. He could only prepare hearts to endure it. He prayed more, not as a retreat into private consolation, but as a way of standing firm in reality. He likely fasted, offering his own comfort for the sake of his flock. He spoke to the believers about remaining united with their bishops and presbyters, not because he craved authority, but because he knew that in persecution, scattered sheep are the easiest prey. He urged them to gather around the Eucharist and to see in it the medicine of immortality, the food that teaches the soul to live in Christ beyond the reach of swords. His teaching was not abstract, it was survival shaped by grace. And perhaps in the quiet of his own heart, Ignatius also began to accept that this tightening of the world might soon tighten around him personally. He was an old man, and old men have a way of sensing when a season is turning. He had served the church through years of uncertainty. He had spoken peace into frightened rooms. Now the empire's shadow lengthened, and he did not shrink from it. If the Lord asked a final witness of him, he would give it. Not with bravado, but with the same steady love that had carried him through ordinary days. At some point the thought must have come to him, not as a desire for pain, but as a clarity. The church will need a word forged in fire. If God allows that fire to touch me, let His people be strengthened by it. And so we end this part with Antioch standing under a sky that grows darker, feeling the distant thunder become closer, and Ignatius, the shepherd, still walking calmly among his flock, preparing them for what may come, even as he prepares himself. The city waits again, carrying fear like a hidden ember. Then one day the ember flared, and the shepherd was seized, not in a scene of theater, but in the plain, unsettling way that arrests often come, like a door opened too quickly in the early hours, like boots on stone, like a name spoken with official coldness. The world that had been tightening around Antioch at last took hold of Ignatius personally. We do not have a detailed record of the exact moment, no careful description of which street he was on, what he was holding, whether the sun was high or low. History gives us only the shape of what happened, and perhaps that is fitting, because martyrdom is not born from spectacle, but from fidelity. It is enough to know that soldiers came for him as they had come for others, and that his community felt the shock of it like a wound reopening. One can imagine the hush that followed, the way word moved through homes and courtyards, the way faces turned pale, the way hands clutched rosary like knots of invisible thread, long before such beads were formalized, as if the human heart already knew how to hold prayer when language fails. Ignatius was the bishop. His arrest was not only the taking of one man, it was the tearing away of a father from his children. The church in Antioch had survived partly because he had been their center of gravity, not by power, but by love. Now Rome's hand reached into that center and pulled him out. It is hard to overstate what that would have felt like. For believers who were already afraid, the loss of their shepherd could have seemed like the beginning of collapse. Some would have been tempted to hide deeper, to stop gathering, to let silence become a kind of shelter. Others would have wanted to rush forward, to plead with officials, to bribe guards, to bargain for his release. Yet in the midst of their panic, Ignatius appears to have been almost unnervingly calm, as if his heart had been preparing for this hour longer than anyone knew. How did he meet the soldiers? We can only imagine, but the character of his later letters suggests a man who did not meet violence with hatred. Perhaps he looked at them with a tired kindness. Perhaps he asked their names. Perhaps he prayed quietly, even while they fastened iron to his wrists. Men who arrest others often expect pleading or rage. It must have startled them to find neither. Ignatius did not deny the sorrow of leaving his people, but he did not add fear to sorrow. If his flock were watching, or if they heard afterward from those who had seen, they would have heard that their bishop did not tremble like a defeated man. He walked like someone who belonged to God already. And still, the pain was real. Even the holiest heart feels the ache of separation. Ignatius had lived long in Antioch. Its streets were stitched into his memory. Its believers were not an abstract crowd, but faces he had baptized, married, reconciled, buried. He had listened to their confessions, held their infants, argued with them, laughed with them, prayed beside them when they were sick. Now all of that was being cut away in an instant. A bishop is not a bishop alone. He is bishop with his church. So to take him from them was to tear a bond that had been forged by grace. We should let ourselves feel this quiet grief. Holiness does not erase love. It purifies it, and purified love can hurt even more deeply because it is not tangled in selfishness, only in communion. As the soldiers led him away, the community would have followed at a distance, as far as safety allowed. Some may have wept openly. Others may have tried to keep their tears hidden, afraid to reveal themselves. Perhaps a presbyter walked near enough to hear a final word. Perhaps a deacon slipped him water. Perhaps children pressed forward until their mothers pulled them back. We cannot say. Yet we can almost hear Ignatius speaking to them with the gentleness of a man who wants his last gift to be peace. He surely urged them not to fall apart. He likely reminded them that Christ is the true shepherd, that no prison can separate them from the Lord, that unity must not be broken by fear. In such moments, a leader's final look can become a letter written into memory, and that look, one imagines, was steady and full of blessing. Rome's plan was not to execute him quietly in Antioch. They wanted him carried to the capital, a living trophy, proof that the empire could seize even the highest Christian leaders and parade them toward the arena. Transporting prisoners to Rome also served another purpose. It warned the churches along the way. A chained bishop marching through provinces was a sermon Rome preached without words. This is what awaits stubborn faith. Yet Rome was about to discover that some sermons backfire, because the sight of Ignatius in chains would not extinguish Christian hearts. It would kindle them. The journey began almost immediately. Antioch fell behind as the road opened ahead, a road he had likely traveled before in freedom, but now would travel in iron. We should picture the practical misery of it, the weight of chains rubbing skin raw, the uneven pace of guards, the dust rising from sandals, the cold nights, the cramped quarters where prisoners were kept. Ignatius was old. Travel alone would have been hard even without captivity. Yet he did not interpret this suffering as senseless. For him, the road was not only a punishment, it was a last pilgrimage, a path on which he could offer himself to God and strengthen the churches he would pass through. Grace does not wait for comfort. It grows where it is planted, even in dust and iron. There is something deeply human in thinking about what he might have carried inside himself as he left. Did he remember certain hymns sung in Antioch? Did he replay the faces of those most vulnerable, the widows, the young, the ones who struggled with courage? Did he worry about who would guide them now? Of course he did. Even if he trusted God, trust does not cancel concern. Yet he also knew that the church did not begin with him and would not end with him. The same Spirit who had sustained Antioch before his bishopric would sustain Antioch after it. Perhaps that thought steadied him more than anything else. I am not the foundation. Christ is. The guards assigned to him are remembered in later tradition as harsh, and he himself would later call them leopards, a word that suggests not only cruelty, but unpredictability. A prisoner cannot count on consistent kindness. One guard might be indifferent, another brutal. One day the pace might be slow, another day rushed. Ignatius would have had no control over these rhythms. The only control he had was the control of his heart, the choice to respond with prayer rather than bitterness. That choice, repeated hour by hour, is what makes a martyr long before the arena. Martyrdom is not only the final moment, it is the steady refusal to let suffering turn into hatred. As they moved north and west, the road would have carried him through landscapes of startling beauty that did not soften his chains. Hills rising in pale light, olive groves, villages waking to smoke from cooking fires, distant sea glimmering under a hard sky. Beauty and brutality often live side by side in this world, and for Ignatius that contrast may have sharpened his awareness of eternity. The world is lovely, yes, and also broken. Christ entered that brokenness not to despise the world, but to redeem it. Ignatius, walking in pain, was now participating in that redemption with his own body. His community in Antioch could not follow him. Their part now was to endure without him, to remain one without his physical presence. For them, his departure would have left a hollow, a silence at the Eucharistic table where his voice had been. Yet even that silence could become a kind of seed. They would remember his steadiness. They would remember his teaching. They would remember, perhaps most of all, that he did not cling to life as a possession, but offered it as a gift to God. That memory would become a lamp for them in the coming darkness. So the road begins, with Ignatius chained yet strangely free in spirit, leaving Antioch not as a man dragged unwillingly into fate, but as a shepherd who trusts the shepherd of all. The city behind him is wounded and frightened, the empire ahead of him vast and merciless, and still he walks, carrying the church in his heart, as if every step were a prayer. Antioch fades behind him like a wounded memory. Bound in iron, he discovers that chains can also become a pathway, and the first stretch of his march away from Antioch unfolded like a long, quiet stripping of everything familiar. The city's noise was replaced by the rhythm of footsteps and the creak of leather, by the short commands of soldiers and the low murmur of travelers who passed without knowing the old man's name. Each day moved according to Rome's schedule, not his own. The guards decided when they walked, when they rested, how fast the line of prisoners would go, where they would sleep. For a bishop who had spent years guiding others, this sudden loss of control might have felt like a kind of humiliation, and perhaps it did. Yet Ignatius received it as a hidden lesson. He had preached that Christ emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Now the bishop was being asked to live that emptying not in words but in bone and breath. He did not seek humiliation, but he did not resist it either. In his heart he understood that if the Lord allowed him to be led like this, then obedience itself could become a prayer. The road out of Antioch carried him through the familiar contours of Syria, then into regions where the faces and accents changed, where the land opened into long stretches of scrub and stone. We can imagine the physical ache of these days. The iron at his wrists and perhaps around his ankles rubbed the skin raw. The older the body, the more each step requires intention. Sweat gathered, dust clung, the sun beat down by day, and at night the air could turn sharp and cold. Travel in the ancient world was never easy, even for the free, and for the imprisoned it was misery. Yet misery, for Ignatius, was not empty. He did not interpret suffering as proof that God had abandoned him. He interpreted it as a chance to cling more tightly to Christ. If the body was weary, the soul could still be wide awake. He had no books with him, no scrolls of scripture to read by lamplight, no quiet corner to retreat to. But he carried something deeper than parchment. He carried the words he had heard for decades, the psalms he had prayed, the gospel passages he had repeated to his flock. These lived in his memory like a second bloodstream. As the road stretched on, he would have recited them silently, letting them move through him again and again. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his faithful ones. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. Such words are not decorations when a man is in chains. They are breath, they are food, they are a hand held out in darkness. The soldiers who guarded him were not saints. Some were likely indifferent, some rough, some perhaps openly cruel. A prisoner in those days was a thing, not a person, and being treated as a thing can waste a man's spirit if he allows it. Ignatius did not allow it. In his later letters he would speak of guards who grew harsher the more he tried to be kind, as if gentleness irritated them. That detail tells us something about his manner, even now. He was not spitting bitterness. He was offering humanity. He was trying to love the men who controlled his pace, because Christ had loved his own executioners. To do this is not soft weakness. It is a fierce kind of holiness, It is the refusal to let another person's sin determine the shape of your heart. There is also the quiet mystery of what passed through his mind about Antioch itself. He was leaving behind a community he had served for years, leaving it in the hands of God and of the presbyters he had formed. The temptation in such a moment is to worry without end, to replay every fragile situation, to imagine worst outcomes. Ignatius surely felt concern, but he did not let concern become despair. He had taught his people that the church is Christ's body, and a body does not lose its life because one limb is wounded. He had to practice that belief now. The Lord who planted the church in Antioch would not abandon her because one bishop was taken. If anything, this trial could purify her love, knit her together more deeply, make her faith stronger, even if it would hurt terribly along the way. Ignatius offered his separation as a sacrifice for their unity, a kind of invisible protecting wall, not made of stone, but of intercession. At times on the road, he may have been allowed to stop in small towns or roadside stations where prisoners were held overnight. Such places were crowded and loud, full of smells of sweat, animals, smoke, and old straw. There would have been other prisoners, some thieves, some political rebels, perhaps a few other Christians. We do not know whether he spoke much to them. His style suggests a man who listened more than he performed, and who used speech carefully. But even a quiet word from him, a blessing murmured, a reminder that Christ is near, could have been a lantern to a soul in despair. It is possible that even before his famous letters, Ignatius was already preaching by presence, by the strange peace that rested on him. He also had to face the small daily humiliations that come with captivity. A bishop, once treated with affection by his people, now needed guards to loosen his chains for rest, to hand him food as if feeding an animal, to decide when he could relieve himself. Such dependence can either corrupt a heart into anger or refine it into humility. For Ignatius, it became refinement. He did not cling to status. He had spent years reminding believers that greatness in Christ is measured by service. Now service was what he was living, not by choice of tasks, but by surrender to circumstances. In a way, this surrender itself was transforming him. It was making him light enough to be carried by grace all the way to the end. And there were moments, surely, when the road presented a paradoxical beauty. The ancient world did not lack for splendor. Even in chains, a prisoner could lift his eyes and see a sky washed clean after rain, a line of mountains turning purple in late sun, a field of wildflowers nodding in wind. Such sights do not remove pain, but they can remind the soul that God's world is still good, still held in his care. Ignatius may have received these moments as gentle mercies, like a father slipping water to a thirsty child. They might also have carried a sharper message. This life is lovely and fleeting. The kingdom comes. Walk toward it. As days turned into weeks, the bishop's inner resolve seemed to deepen rather than weaken. He was beginning to understand that Rome's intention to make him a spectacle could be turned into a different spectacle altogether, not of fear, but of faith. A chained bishop crossing provinces could show Christians everywhere that grace is real, that unity is possible, that the gospel does not crumble under iron. Ignatius had no stage, no pulpit, no authority in Rome's eyes, and yet he was becoming a moving altar, a living homily. His suffering was not a private tragedy. It was a public witness, even before the arena. It is important to feel the gentleness of his courage. He was not rushing toward death like a man chasing glory. He was walking toward whatever God allowed, step by step, letting each step be enough for that day. He did not know precisely how long the journey would be, what twists it would take, whether illness might claim him before Rome, whether officials might change plans. All he knew was that Christ was with him now. That was enough. Faith often grows not by seeing the whole path, but by trusting the next few feet of it. So the first stretch of this march becomes a kind of slow interior purification. Antioch is gone from sight. The empire is all around. The body weakens, the soul steadies. He is a shepherd without a flock in front of him, and yet the flock lives in his heart. He is a prisoner of Rome, and yet he is also a free man in Christ. The chains do not tell the final story. They are only the dark frame around a light that grows clearer the closer he comes to his offering. So the old bishop walks on, carrying a church inside his ribs, learning with every mile that God can turn even captivity into pilgrimage, and that love, once rooted in Christ, can travel anywhere. Word traveled faster than footsteps, and believers began to seek him out, so that as Ignatius moved farther from Antioch, he also found himself strangely surrounded by a widening circle of love. The empire had intended his march to be a warning, a sight that would make Christians hide. Yet the opposite began to happen. In city after city, little communities listened for news of the chained bishop, and when they learned his route, they came to him quietly, cautiously, with the reverence one gives to a living witness. It was not a parade in the open streets. Such gatherings would have been dangerous. It was more like a river of hidden mercy flowing alongside him, appearing at side paths, in the corners of courtyards, in the hush of evening when guards were tired and less watchful. These Christians did not come because they loved suffering. They came because they loved Christ, and because in Ignatius they saw the gospel standing on two bruised feet. We do not know the exact sequence of towns as he crossed into Asia Minor, but tradition places him at places like Smyrna and Troas, and along the way other communities may have met him too. The important thing is the shape of what happened. Wherever he went, men and women came to greet him, to bring food, to offer water, to kneel for blessing, to ask for a word. Some were presbyters and deacons, others were ordinary believers who had never seen a bishop from another city. Many may have been poor. Some may have had scars from their own brushes with persecution. All were hungry for reassurance. For them, the church was still young, still learning her own boundaries, still wondering what it meant to survive from one generation to the next, when the empire wanted her erased. To see an old bishop walking in chains yet radiating peace was like seeing the future held steady in the present. Ignatius, exhausted as he was, did not refuse these meetings. One might think that a prisoner would want only rest to conserve strength for the ordeal ahead. But to Ignatius, strength was not only physical, it was spiritual, and it increased when shared. He received their care with gratitude, but he also gave care back. There is a tenderness in imagining this. The old man sitting with iron on his wrists, head bowed in prayer while believers gathered around him, the guards nearby but perhaps half indifferent, and Ignatius speaking softly, steadying their hearts. He had left Antioch with a wound of separation, and now God was meeting that wound with a kind of consolation. The church was larger than his grief. The same faith he had guarded in Antioch was alive here too, breathing in different accents, housed in different streets, but one body all the same. These encounters also taught him something about how persecution was shaping Christians across the empire. In some places, the faithful were already hardened by suffering, their eyes sharp, their trust in God deepened by loss. In other places, they were still new and fragile, unsettled by rumors, afraid to draw attention. Ignatius saw both kinds of souls, and his heart expanded to hold them. He did not think in narrow terms of his own city's needs anymore. The road was making him Catholic in spirit before he ever used the word. He was seeing the church as a single living organism stretching across provinces, a family bound by the same Eucharist and the same hope. At the same time, these visits were not only comfort, they were responsibility. When Christians came to him, they came with questions, sometimes burning ones. What should we do if we are accused? How do we remain one when false teachers try to split us? How do we honor the bishop without turning him into a rival of Christ? How do we live in peace with neighbors who despise us? Ignatius answered as a shepherd answers, not with clever display, but with careful truth. He urged them to cling to Christ, to gather around their bishops and presbyters as the visible sign of unity, to avoid those who twisted the gospel into something less than the flesh of the incarnate Lord. His words were not complicated. They were like stones set in a riverbed, meant to keep people from being swept away. And perhaps in these gatherings, Ignatius also began to sense how his own martyrdom could serve them. He did not need to die for the church to exist. Christ had already died and risen. Yet a martyr's peace can become a testimony that strengthens others. Ignatius knew this. He did not crave death for its own sake, but he recognized that if the Lord allowed his death to stand as a sign, then it could steady many hearts. So he began to speak of suffering not as catastrophe, but as communion, the sharing in Christ that no empire could forbid. That message, offered quietly on roadside evenings, would ferment later into the fire of his letters. There was also the deeply human element of friendship. Some of these visitors were not strangers. They may have been men Ignatius had met years earlier, perhaps in councils, perhaps on journeys, perhaps through the exchange of messengers. The early church, though scattered, was knitted together by networks of care. Bishops knew of one another, prayed for one another. When such friends met Ignatius now, in chains, the reunion must have been both beautiful and painful. They would have wanted to rescue him, to send bribes, to plead with officials. Ignatius, however, was already moving into the interior space where surrender grows. He would have thanked them for their love, but he would also have asked them to let him follow the path God had permitted. In this he was not rejecting them. He was loving them in a deeper way, refusing to let their fear dictate his fidelity. As these communities gathered around him, another kind of exchange took place, quiet and profound. They brought him their prayers, and he brought them his witness. They brought him bread and water, and he brought them the bread of teaching and the water of hope. They saw his chains, and he saw their faces. In that mutual gaze, the church, under persecution, practiced what she would later teach: that suffering shared in love does not destroy communion. It forges it. The empire could bind a bishop's wrists, but it could not bind the tenderness with which believers cared for one another. In fact, the more Rome squeezed, the more love seeped out along the cracks. It is worth pausing to imagine the effect of these meetings on Ignatius's own heart. For weeks he had walked with only guards around him, hearing mostly harsh voices. Now he heard prayers whispered with reverence. He heard the gentle questions of the faithful. He felt hands offering him food, as if feeding Christ himself. Such moments do not erase pain, but they remind a man that he does not walk alone. Perhaps for the first time since Antioch, his eyes filled not with grief, but with gratitude. God was showing him that the church he loved had roots deeper than any one city, and that even in persecution she was alive, attentive, caring. And still, every meeting ended the same way. The guards called time. The believers slipped back into shadow. Ignatius was led forward again. Each farewell must have felt like a small rehearsal of the larger farewell awaiting him in Rome. Yet these goodbyes were softer because they were wrapped in hope. He was not leaving them into emptiness. He was leaving them into Christ, and they knew it. Their tears were not only sorrow, they were also reverence for a man who was teaching them how to die without losing love. So the road in Asia Minor becomes for Ignatius both a corridor of suffering and a corridor of communion. The empire tries to isolate him, but God surrounds him with his people. The empire tries to turn him into a warning, but God turns him into a blessing. The old bishop's body grows weaker, yes, but his heart grows larger, because it is being stretched to embrace a church wider than he had ever physically seen. And as he is led onward, he begins to understand that his final witness will not belong to Antioch alone. It will belong to all these scattered communities, to the whole body of believers, to the church that is already Catholic in spirit, even before the word is spoken. Their tears follow him as he is led onward, and his heart grows both heavier and brighter. When he could no longer remain in places he loved, he learned to remain through words, and so the candles of his presence began to turn into the brighter, longer flame of his letters. The road had brought him to the edge of Smyrna, and there the church welcomed him not with noise, but with a hush full of devotion. The bishop of Smyrna, Polycarp, a man already revered among Christians and known as a disciple of the Apostle John, met Ignatius with the tenderness of one shepherd greeting another. Their meeting must have carried something of the early church's strange mixture of grief and consolation. Two old men formed in the apostolic echo, now sitting together, while one of them was on his way to die. The time they had was short. Guards were never fully absent. Yet within those limitations, grace created a little room of fellowship. And in that room, Ignatius felt the urgency of leaving behind what his voice could no longer speak in person. He had been speaking to the faithful along the road, yes, in brief gatherings and whispered blessings, but he knew that such moments vanish like breath in cold air. A letter could travel where he could not. A letter could remain after he was gone. A letter could gather the churches into one mind and heart, even when fear tempted them to scatter. Ignatius did not set out to become an author. He set out to be faithful. But fidelity sometimes takes the shape of writing, especially when the body is being carried where it does not wish to go. The bishop understood that if Rome intended his march to silence him, the Holy Spirit could use that very march to make his voice louder than ever. So he began to write. We should imagine the difficulty of it. He had no quiet study, no desk, no steady lamp. He wrote as a prisoner writes, perhaps in a borrowed room under watch, perhaps during a pause in travel, perhaps seated on a rough bench with chains clinking softly every time he moved his wrist. He likely did not write the letters in his own hand. In the ancient world, bishops often dictated to trusted scribes, and in his case, the faithful who visited him would have helped, bringing parchment, ink, and willing hands. His words were spoken out loud, shaped in the air, then caught by another person's pen and fixed onto the page. There is a marvel in that image, the voice of a chained old man becoming ink that would cross seas and centuries. The act of dictation itself would have required focus and prayer. Ignatius was not composing poetry for pleasure. He was pouring out what might be his final counsel. Each letter had to hold both truth and tenderness, firmness and peace. He had to speak simply enough for the ordinary believer to be strengthened, yet clearly enough for bishops and presbyters to recognize the seriousness of his counsel. His letters, even when urgent, were not frantic. They carry the rhythm of someone who has already surrendered his life to God. That surrender gives a strange clarity. When a man no longer needs to protect his own future, he can speak with a purity that is hard to imitate. And what did he write about first? Not himself, not his suffering, not the injustice of Rome. He wrote about unity. This was the chord that had always lived in his heart, and captivity only made it more urgent. He had seen how easily fear could fracture a community, how quickly false teachings could wedge believers apart, how tempting it was to form little private interpretations of faith instead of living the faith together. Unity for Ignatius was not a polite preference. It was the shape of Christ's body. If the church was to endure persecution, she had to endure as one. A scattered flock would be devoured. A united flock could stand even under Rome. He also wrote about the Eucharist, because he knew it was the deepest root of unity. Bread and wine consecrated into Christ's body, and blood were not, to him, symbolic comfort only. They were the very medicine of immortality, the God-given food that makes the church one flesh with Christ, and therefore one body with each other. When he spoke of the Eucharist, he did so with a firmness that sounds almost startling until one remembers the stakes. If believers began to treat the Eucharist lightly, or to doubt Christ's real presence, then the center of their life would hollow out. A hollowed center cannot withstand trial. Ignatius wanted them fed with reality, not with ideas. And he wrote about Christ's incarnation, because the truth that God had truly taken flesh was the ground beneath everything else. If Christ was not truly human, then suffering had no divine companion. If Christ's death was only an illusion, then martyrdom was absurd. If Christ did not rise in a real body, then hope was a dream. Ignatius wrote as a man who had lived the faith close to its sources and now was about to stake his life on it. He wanted no mist around Christ. He wanted Christians to hold the Lord as real, tangible, crucified, risen, present. The clearer Christ was in their minds, the stronger Christ would be in their courage. His letters also reveal the pastoral heart of someone who knows the church is made of fragile people. He did not speak as if every believer were already a hero. He spoke knowing that fear is part of being human, that doubt visits even the faithful, that unity requires constant tending. His urgency comes from love, not from irritation. He is like a father calling across a storm to children he cannot physically protect. He is not scolding them for trembling. He is telling them where to stand so they will not be swept away. We should pause and feel what it meant for the churches to receive these letters. A messenger would arrive quietly, perhaps after days of travel, carrying a scroll sealed and precious. The local bishop and presbyters would gather the community in a safe place, maybe before dawn, and someone would read Ignatius's words aloud. Imagine the silence as they heard his voice through the messenger's mouth. Imagine the mixture of grief and pride, knowing their brother bishop was on the way to die, yet still caring for them more than for his own comfort. Imagine the way those words would settle into their hearts, not as a lecture, but as a living presence. Through writing, Ignatius was still with them. Through writing, he was still shepherding. And for Ignatius himself, each letter was also a kind of offering. Every time he dictated a line, he stepped a little more out of his own private sorrow and into the larger mission God had placed in his hands. He was not merely preparing to die, he was preparing the church to live. His body might soon be broken, but his words could become a scaffold of faith that would hold others upright. In that sense, the letters were already a participation in martyrdom. They were his blood before blood, his witness before witness, his way of letting the church drink from his courage while he still had breath. There is a tender paradox here. Rome was chaining him to make him powerless, yet those very chains created the moment when the church gained one of her most enduring voices. The road that seemed to narrow his life was widening his influence. The isolation that Rome intended was being turned by God into communion across distance. It is as if the Spirit said to Ignatius, "You will not remain in Antioch, but you will remain in the hearts of many. You will not govern in person, but you will guide through love poured into ink." So in Smyrna, and in the pauses that followed, Ignatius became not only a martyr in motion, but a teacher for generations. The letters began to leave his hands like small flames carried into the night, each one meant to keep a community warm with truth, each one meant to remind believers that they are not alone, that the church is one, that the Eucharist is life, that Christ is real, and that death itself cannot destroy communion when communion is rooted in Him. And even as the last words of a letter dried on parchment, the guards were ready again, the road ready again, and Ignatius, breathing slow and calm, ready again to walk. Each letter leaves his hands like a candle set against the dark. The candles he lit were not gentle lights only, but steady calls to stand together, and the first letters that went out from his chain-bound heart carried this rhythm of unity like a heartbeat, meant to be heard across many rooms. In Smyrna and the places nearby, with the road still pulling him forward and the arena still far but certain, Ignatius dictated to the churches of Ephesus, Magnesia, and Tralles, communities he could not visit freely but loved as if they were his own children. These churches were alive and growing, yet they were also vulnerable in the very ways Antioch had been vulnerable, threatened not only by Rome's suspicion, but by the quieter dangers that creep in when believers are tired or afraid. Ignatius knew that the enemy of the church is not always a sword drawn in public. Sometimes it is the slow loosening of trust, the small pride that says, "I do not need the bishop," the subtle teaching that flattens Christ into a myth, the private bitterness that makes a neighbor feel like a rival. So he wrote not to display authority, but to protect love. To the Ephesians he spoke with gratitude first, because gratitude opens the heart before instruction enters. He thanked them for receiving his messengers, for the charity they had shown, and for the way their bishop and people were striving to live as one. Yet even in this gratitude there was a gentle urging, as if he were saying, "Keep going. Do not let your unity become tired. It is easy to be united when life is calm. The test comes when danger arrives, or when voices within begin to quarrel." Ignatius reminded them that their bishop was not a rival to Christ, but a living sign of Christ's shepherding among them, a visible center around which the community could gather without dissolving into scattered opinions. In a world of many philosophies, it was tempting for Christians to become a collection of private believers who happened to share a name. Ignatius insisted that the church is something deeper, a single body, and that a body needs a heart that keeps its rhythm. The bishop, with presbyters and deacons, was meant to serve that rhythm, not to dominate it. He was calling them to a unity that was not political obedience, but sacramental communion, a unity born from sharing the same Christ. To the Magnesians he addressed a slightly different tension, one that had troubled many early churches, the relationship between Jewish Christian roots and Gentile Christian freedom. Some believers were tempted to slip back into old patterns of the law as if Christ had not fulfilled it, while others were tempted to mock those patterns as if Israel had been in error. Ignatius urged them to live in the newness of Christ without contempt for what had come before, because contempt always splits the heart. His message was simple and spacious, that Christ is the center in whom all things are gathered, and that to be Christian is to live on the Lord's day, so to speak, not because the old covenant was worthless, but because the new covenant has opened the fullness of life. In his voice we hear a shepherd who does not want his people trapped in arguments that shrink their love. He wanted them to look at one another and see not a threat, but a brother or sister reclaimed by the same Savior. To the Trallians he offered praise and warning mingled together. He admired their steadfastness, their charity, their willingness to obey their bishop and presbyters. But he also sensed the presence of false teachers who moved like shadows through communities, using clever words to unsettle simple faith. These teachers often claimed a higher knowledge, a purer spirituality, and their pride could be seductive. Ignatius saw that pride as poison. He warned the Trallians not to be dazzled by anyone who separated Jesus Christ from true flesh and true suffering, because such a separation would also separate believers from one another. For Ignatius, doctrine and love were never enemies. True doctrine guarded love. If Christ had truly taken flesh, then every human body mattered, including the bodies that Rome bruised. If Christ had truly suffered, then the suffering of Christians was a sharing in his life, not a meaningless cruelty. If Christ truly rose, then hope was not fantasy, but a doorway already opened. Therefore, false doctrine was not an intellectual annoyance. It was a wound to the soul of the Church. Over and over in these letters, one senses Ignatius returning to the Eucharist as the living center. He speaks as if the Eucharist is not only something the Church does, but something that creates the Church. By gathering around one altar and receiving one bread, believers are made one body, regardless of their background, temperament, or fears. For a listener in later centuries, this might sound like a high theology, but for Ignatius it was practical survival. A fracturing community could not endure persecution. A Eucharistic community, held together by Christ's real presence, could endure anything, even when members were taken away one by one. His language about the Eucharist is tender and uncompromising, the way a father speaks about the food his children must eat to live. He will not let the faithful reduce it to a symbol, because symbols cannot feed the starving soul. At the same time, his emphasis on unity is never cold. He does not say, "Obey the bishop because order matters." He says, "Stay close to the bishop because love needs a shape." He compares unity to harmony in music, where many notes become one song, not by flattening difference, but by turning difference into beauty. This is why he urges believers to avoid private cliques, to avoid the kind of spiritual pride that says, "I can live the faith without the Church." For Ignatius, faith is not a solitary mountain climb. It is a pilgrim people walking together, holding one another upright, because Christ himself chose to gather disciples rather than saving souls one by one in isolation. To refuse unity is to refuse the way Christ built his Church. We also hear in these letters an astonishing calm about his own suffering. He does not center the letters on his pain. He mentions his chains almost in passing, as if they were a footnote to the more urgent story of Christ. And yet his chains are in every line because they have purified his gaze. He writes like a man stripped of distractions, seeing with startling simplicity what matters most. The Church must be one. The Eucharist must be revered as Christ's true gift. Christ must be confessed as truly incarnate, truly crucified, truly risen. Christians must live in love rather than in fear. These are the pillars he keeps setting down like stones on a road, so that the faithful do not lose their way in the dark. Imagine the effect of this on the communities receiving the letters. They had never met Ignatius in person, many of them, yet they recognized the voice of a true father. The letters would have been read aloud in quiet gatherings, and as the words filled the room, believers would have felt the strange closeness of a bishop who was not theirs by city, yet was theirs by Christ. They would also have felt a certain holy shame at any small divisions they had tolerated, because here was an old man on his way to death, and his main concern was not himself, but their unity. Such a witness makes petty quarrels feel as small as they truly are. It draws the heart back to what is central. And for Ignatius, sending these letters was like breathing out a final gift. Each messenger who departed carried not only ink, but his pastoral heart. He knew he might never see these believers again in this world. He might never correct a misunderstanding face to face. So he poured as much clarity and tenderness as he could into words, trusting the Spirit to carry the rest. There is humility in that trust, the humility of a man who knows that even his letters are only instruments in God's hands. And still the road stretches, asking more from his failing body, as the lamps of his letters continue to flicker outward into the widening night. As he neared new cities, he felt again the ache of a family that could splinter, and so his next letters rose from the same deep well, but with an even sharper tenderness, as if time itself were pressing on his shoulder. After Smyrna, the road carried him onward toward Troas, and along that stretch, as the guards urged the prisoners forward and the sea wind began to taste of the Aegean, Ignatius dictated to the Philadelphians and the Smyrnaeans, and also sent a personal word to Polycarp. These were not casual notes. They were the concentrated breath of a man who knew he was speaking close to the edge of his earthly life, and who wanted his final breath to be useful for the peace of the church. Philadelphia was a community where unity was being tested in a particular way. They were faithful, yes, but among them certain voices were stirring division, especially around questions of doctrine and authority. Ignatius had seen this pattern before. When a church is frightened by persecution, the instinct to seek safety can twist into the instinct to seek control, and control can seduce people into forming factions. One group may say, "We are the true ones." Another may say, "No, we are." And soon the family begins to speak in rival tongues. Ignatius did not approach this with anger. He approached it like a physician approaching a wound, knowing that the wound hurts because the body still cares about itself. His counsel to Philadelphia was simple in its urgency. Do not let yourselves be pulled apart. Do not chase private teachings that set you against your bishop. Do not imagine that holiness is found in separating from the body of the church. If Christ is one, then his people must be one. If the altar is one, then the gathering must be one. He reminded them that the bishop is a gift meant to protect unity, not a human idol. In an age when Christianity could easily have become a movement of scattered teachers, each with their own version of the gospel, the bishop served as a living link to the apostolic faith. Ignatius did not speak of bishops as if they were flawless, but as if they were necessary, like the keel of a ship in rough water. Without a keel, a ship may still float, but it cannot hold its direction. Without a bishop, a community may still be religious, but it can drift into whatever spiritual wind blows hardest. So he urged them, cling to the bishop not because a man deserves flattery, but because Christ deserves to have his body remain whole. At the same time, Ignatius spoke with care about how to discern truth. He did not want believers to become mere followers of personalities. He wanted them anchored in the gospel. Yet he knew that the gospel itself had been entrusted to the church, not to solitary individuals, and so he shaped a kind of rhythm for them. Listen to the bishop, because the bishop listens to Christ. Gather around the presbyters, because they are the counsel of God in your midst. Honor the deacons, because they serve Christ's mercy among you. In this way, the whole community becomes a living harmony, and false voices lose their power to isolate anyone. From this letter we catch a glimpse of Ignatius's own heart. He was not afraid that the church would fail because persecution was strong. He was afraid she would fail because love might grow thin inside fear. He had seen that Rome could kill bodies, yes, but internal division could kill communion. So he kept returning them to peace, to forgiveness, to mutual reverence, because peace is not weakness. Peace is the posture of Christ, and it is the posture that makes a suffering church luminous in the dark. To the Smyrnaeans, his tone shifted slightly, because the threat he sensed there was more explicitly doctrinal. In Smyrna, certain teachers were spreading a view that Christ had not truly taken flesh, that his suffering was only the appearance of suffering, that his death was some kind of divine play rather than a real human agony. Such ideas might have sounded sophisticated, even comforting, to people who were terrified of pain. If Christ did not really suffer, then perhaps their own suffering could be dismissed as unimportant. But to Ignatius, this was not comfort. It was a betrayal of love. If Christ did not truly become human, then humanity had not truly been redeemed. If Christ did not truly bleed, then his love was a mirage. And if his love was a mirage, then the martyrs were dying for a shadow. So Ignatius wrote with a clear, fatherly firmness. Christ was truly born. Christ truly ate and drank. Christ truly suffered under Pontius Pilate. Christ truly died. Christ truly rose in the flesh. These words are not set down as a dry creed. They are set down as a lifeline. A persecuted church needs a real Savior, not a symbolic one, because only a real Savior can hold them in real pain. Ignatius feared that if the Smyrnaeans drifted into a faith where Christ was less than fully human, they would also drift into a faith where other humans mattered less. And once human bodies are made small in theology, they become small in practice. Such theology can become the seed of cruelty. Ignatius would not allow that seed to be planted. In the same letter, he returned to the Eucharist, pointing out that those who deny Christ's real flesh also tend to deny the Eucharist as his real gift. Again, he was not arguing for argument's sake. He was protecting the Church from starvation. If the Eucharist is only a symbol, then when believers face death, what do they hold? If the Eucharist is Christ himself, then they hold God in their mouths, and fear loses its final grip. Ignatius's language about the sacraments sounds almost like the language of someone who has already crossed into eternity and is calling back to those still on the path, telling them where the true food lies. And then there is his letter to Polycarp, the personal note that shows a different side of him, softer and more intimate. Polycarp was younger, a bishop still preparing for trials of his own. Ignatius wrote to encourage him to remain firm, to care for his flock, to be patient with the weak, to bear the burdens of each soul. He speaks not as a rival bishop, but as an older brother passing a mantle of courage. The church in those days depended on such bonds. Bishops were not isolated leaders. They were part of a living network, strengthening one another across distance. Ignatius knew that after his death the work would go on, carried by men like Polycarp. So he spoke to him with a kind of affectionate gravity, urging him to keep the church one and faithful, no matter what storms came. Through all these letters, one can feel Ignatius's inner life tightening into clarity. The road has stripped away anything unnecessary. There is no room now for vanity, for distraction, for half-beliefs. He is speaking from a place where truth and love are fused. That fusion gives his words their distinctive warmth. He does not speak like a judge calling out errors to win a debate. He speaks like a father who wants his children to survive and to stay close enough to one another that they can recognize Christ in each other's faces. We should also notice how naturally he moves between doctrine and tenderness, because for him they are not two separate things. The truth about Christ is not a set of cold statements. It is the shape of a love that entered flesh for our sake. If that truth is blurred, love is blurred. If that truth is clear, love becomes clear too. So Ignatius insists on clarity precisely because he wants communities to be gentle. A church that knows Christ truly suffered is a church that can suffer without hatred. A church that knows Christ truly rose is a church that can face death without despair. A church that knows Christ gives himself in the Eucharist is a church that can remain united even when the empire tries to tear it apart. As these letters left him, the road did not pause. Troas awaited, then the sea crossing, then Italy, then Rome. Ignatius's body was thinning, his joints stiff, his eyes perhaps dimmer with fatigue. Yet his spirit was strangely steady, even bright. He had done what he could to strengthen the churches in his path. He had said what needed to be said. Now his remaining task was to keep walking, to keep praying, to keep offering his fear and his love to Christ. And perhaps in the quiet between footsteps, as night fell and the guards' voices softened into distance, he felt a deeper peace settling over him. The peace of someone who has placed everything in God's hands and is content to be carried wherever those hands lead. The bishop breathes slow prayers into the night, knowing time is thinning. Some words appear quietly, then echo through centuries, and on this road of dust and iron one such word rose from Ignatius's prayer like a seed dropped into the earth. By the time he reached Troas, his letters had already begun to travel outward, and his body, though weary, was still carrying a steady flame. The churches he had met along the way were not simply stopping points for him. They were windows through which he had seen how wide and varied the Christian family had become. In Antioch, he had learned to guard unity against fear and division. On the road, he had learned that this unity was not local only, not bound to one city or one people, but stretched across lands and seas, joined by the same faith, the same Eucharist, the same shepherding care. It is from this widening vision that the word Catholic took shape in his speech, not as a slogan, not as a strategy, but as a natural naming of what he already saw with his own eyes. To understand how simple and profound this moment was, we should remember that the early church did not yet have all the later structures and vocabulary that would grow in centuries to come. There was no grand map of dioceses fixed by law, no imperial recognition, no councils that had yet defined every phrase of doctrine in careful language. The church was still a pilgrim people moving through a hostile world, scattered in small communities, sometimes isolated from one another by distance and danger, yet mysteriously one in spirit. They were one because they shared Christ, and Christ was not divided. They were one because they shared the apostolic faith, passed faithfully from bishop to bishop like a flame handed along in the dark. They were one because they gathered around the Eucharist, which made them not a set of individuals who happened to believe similar things, but a single body nourished by a single Lord. This is what Ignatius was living, and this is what he needed to name. When he wrote his letter to the Smyrnians, He spoke of the Church in a way that was both ordinary and revolutionary. He did not say Catholic to invent something new out of thin air. He said it to describe what already existed. The word itself meant universal, whole, according to the fullness. In his mouth it was like saying, the Church is not a private club of the brave, not a local gathering only, not a splintered group of rival teachings. She is the whole people of God gathered in Christ, wherever they are found, in every city, every province, every language, every hidden house where bread is broken in His name. She is one because Christ is one. She is whole because Christ is whole. She is everywhere because Christ is Lord of everywhere. If the empire tried to treat Christians as a strange sect that could be crushed in one region and forgotten elsewhere, Ignatius was saying, no, we are not scattered fragments. We are one body across the world. We are Catholic. There is something tender about the way this word arises. It does not feel like a politician's coinage. It feels like a shepherd's confession. Ignatius, walking toward martyrdom, wanted nothing more than peace and unity. He longed for the believers to recognize one another as family, even when they could not meet without risk. He feared that persecution might make some communities retreat into themselves, becoming suspicious of outsiders, narrowing the gospel into a tribal refuge. He feared that false teachers might exploit isolation to create rival versions of Christianity. By naming the Church Catholic, he was reminding everyone that the true Church is larger than fear and larger than any private interpretation. She is the communion of all who gather around Christ in the Eucharist and remain in the apostolic faith under their bishops. It was a word meant to widen hearts at the very moment fear wanted to shrink them. We might also notice how closely Catholic is bound to his Eucharistic vision. For Ignatius, the Church becomes visible and whole around the altar. Where the Eucharist is celebrated in unity with the bishop and the apostolic faith, there the Church is present in her fullness, not as an isolated outpost, but as a living cell of one universal body. This is why he could speak of the Church as Catholic without needing a worldly central office or an empire to recognize her. Her universality was sacramental before it was political. It was spiritual before it was institutional. It came from Christ giving himself wholly, universally, to his people. The Eucharist is not a local possession. It is Christ himself, and therefore it gathers all believers into one communion that crosses borders Rome cannot control. Think for a moment how consoling this must have been to the churches receiving his letters. They were small communities living under pressure, sometimes feeling alone, sometimes wondering if they were the last faithful ones in a world that mocked them. Ignatius's word Catholic would have sounded like a gentle hand on the shoulder saying, "You are not alone. Your altar is joined to other altars. Your bishop stands in the same apostolic stream as other bishops. Your suffering is held within a wider suffering. Your hope is held within a wider hope. You belong to a church that is larger than the city that threatens you." This kind of belonging is not sentimental. It is survival. It keeps a frightened soul from thinking that faith is a lonely affair. It teaches Christians to endure not as scattered individuals, but as a people. And there is courage in that peoplehood. Rome could intimidate a solitary believer more easily than a united church. Rome could erase a small sect in one place if it remained a local curiosity. But Rome could not easily extinguish a universal body that saw itself as one across the empire, because what happens in one place reverberates in another, and the blood of martyrs seeds courage elsewhere. Ignatius may not have thought in political terms, but his spiritual naming had spiritual consequences that shaped the Church's resilience. By calling the Church Catholic, he was helping her understand herself as an organism that could not be severed by geography. Her life was in Christ, not in any provincial permission. It is also striking that this word is spoken by a man on his way to die. The universal Church is not named in comfort. She is named in chains. That tells us something about how the Church's identity is forged. It is not forged by seeking safety first. It is forged by fidelity to Christ, even unto death. Ignatius's own journey was becoming a kind of living image of Catholic unity. He belonged to Antioch, yet he was greeted and loved by Ephesus, Magnesia, Tralles, Philadelphia, Smyrna. His body was passing through their lands, but his heart was already home in all of them. A man who is a bishop of one city becomes, in martyrdom, a father to many. So the word Catholic is not abstract for him. It is the reality he is walking through. Perhaps that is why the word endured. It was not a term invented in the safety of a study. It was born from a pastoral heart, looking out over a suffering church and saying the simplest true thing about her. You are one. You are whole. You are everywhere Christ is confessed and the Eucharist is received. You are Catholic. After Troas, the road would soon turn toward the sea. The bishops and believers around Ignatius would have heard that word and carried it into their own prayers, maybe not yet grasping how far it would echo, but feeling its truth in their bones. And Ignatius himself, having named what he had long loved, continued forward with a deeper peace, because he knew that even when his own voice fell silent in Rome, the Catholic Church would remain, breathing through countless hidden rooms, gathering around countless altars, bound together by a Lord no empire could chain. So a new name is spoken on the road, and it stays spoken forever. At last he writes to Rome itself, not with fear, but with a strange gratitude. And the letter that went out from Troas toward the heart of the empire is unlike anything else he had yet dictated on the road. Until now, Ignatius had written chiefly to strengthen churches, to warn them against division, to keep them close to their bishops and the Eucharist, to confess Christ clearly against any shadow of false teaching. But in this letter to the Romans, something more personal rises to the surface, not in the way of complaint or self-display, but in the way a man speaks when he is close enough to death that every word becomes a final offering. He knows that Rome is where his journey is aimed, where the beasts wait and the crowds will gather. And he knows also that the Christians there, out of love, may try to save him. So he writes quickly, urgently, and with a tenderness that is almost startling, asking them to do something that feels against the instinct of affection. He asks them not to rescue him. To understand why he would say such a thing, we must first feel what Rome represented in the Christian imagination of his day. For the empire, Rome was the center, the city of power, marble, and law. A place where emperors were crowned and armies were sent out like iron rivers. For Christians, Rome was also a kind of crossroads of faith. The apostles Peter and Paul had preached and died there, leaving behind a church marked by courage and grief. Rome was not simply another community, it was a place of memory, of apostolic blood, and for Ignatius it had become the place where his own offering would be joined to theirs. He was not going to Rome as a tourist of martyrdom. He was going as a pilgrim to a holy ground of witness, a ground made holy not by architecture, but by love proved unto death. Yet he knows the Roman Christians will be tempted to protect him. Perhaps they had influence among certain officials. Perhaps they had already rescued prisoners before through bribes or petitions. Perhaps they believed it would be better for the church if a bishop as strong as Ignatius survived to guide more communities. All of that is plausible. Love naturally seeks to save. So Ignatius does not shame their love. He honors it. But he asks them to let that love take a different form. Do not let your love become a net that traps me away from the path God has opened. Do not let your compassion soften into fear for me. Love me by letting me follow Christ all the way. This request is not a rejection of life. It is a surrender to a deeper life. Ignatius had lived long enough to see that the Church does not survive by clinging to her leaders as if they were irreplaceable. She survives by clinging to Christ. If Christ asked him to witness through martyrdom, then martyrdom would bear fruit more lasting than any further years of ministry he might have had. Ignatius's desire, then, is not for death as an escape, but for union. He wants to be with Christ in the fullest way he knows how, and he believes that this passage through suffering is part of that union. In his letter, he uses an image that is both gentle and fierce, an image of grain ground into bread. He speaks of himself as wheat that must be crushed so that he may become pure bread for Christ. The image is striking because it ties his martyrdom back to the Eucharist he loved so deeply. Every time he had celebrated the sacred mysteries, he had held bread that began as grain bruised and broken. He saw in that process a mirror of Christ's own passion, and he now sees in it a mirror of his own calling. Just as bread becomes nourishment through being ground and baked, so a martyr becomes nourishment for the Church through offering his life. Comfort will not make that bread. Suffering, received in love, will. There is a humility here that we should not miss. Ignatius is not claiming that his death adds to Christ's saving work, as if the cross were not enough. He knows Christ alone saves, but he also knows that Christ invites his followers to share in his life, and that sharing sometimes takes the shape of sharing in his death. The martyr does not replace Christ. The martyr imitates Christ. Ignatius is simply asking to be allowed to imitate fully without being pulled back into safety by well-meaning hands. At the same time, his letter has a calm confidence that God will make his offering fruitful. He does not speak as if martyrdom were a tragedy that might be worthwhile. He speaks as if it were a gift already held within grace. There is no bitterness toward Rome in his words. Rome is not his true enemy. Sin is the enemy. Fear is the enemy. Division is the enemy. Rome is only the stage on which one more act of fidelity will be played. His gaze stays fixed on Christ, and that fixedness frees him from hatred. This is perhaps the most beautiful part of the letter. The old bishop is walking into the mouth of violence, and yet he is not poisoned by violence. He remains gentle, even joyful, because he belongs to a kingdom that violence cannot reach. We might wonder, hearing this, whether Ignatius ever felt a tremor of natural fear. Of course he did. He was human. A very holy human, but still human. The body knows pain. The imagination can picture the arena. The thought of being torn by beasts is not easy for any flesh to accept. Yet in Ignatius we see what grace does to fear. It does not erase it like a spell. It transforms it. It keeps fear from being the ruler. It allows fear to kneel before love. Ignatius had spent years letting fear kneel in Antioch. Now he was letting it kneel on the road to Rome. His letter is the evidence of that transformation. He is not pretending that death is easy. He is proclaiming that Christ is stronger. The Roman Christians, when they received this letter, must have felt an ache that was almost unbearable. To love someone is to want them safe. To be told that safety would harm his calling is a hard thing to accept. Yet because Ignatius spoke with such tenderness and such clarity, his request was not a harsh command, but a holy invitation. He was inviting them to love Christ in him more than they loved his continued presence. He was inviting them to trust the fruitfulness of martyrdom, even when the heart longs to protect. That is a deep spiritual lesson, one the Church has had to learn many times, that sometimes love looks like holding on, and sometimes love looks like letting go. And for Ignatius, personally, the act of writing this letter was like crossing an interior threshold. Until now, he had been carried toward Rome by soldiers. Now he is also carrying himself toward Rome by choice. The external chains remain, but internally he has stepped fully into consent. He is not being dragged to martyrdom. He is walking to it. In that walking there is peace. He has placed his life in God's hands without reservation, and he wants nothing to interrupt that offering. After sending the letter, the silence around him likely grew. There were fewer meetings, fewer messages that could catch up to him as the guards quickened the pace. The sea crossing awaited. Italy awaited. And under all of it, the arena awaited. Yet the letter to the Romans stands like a calm stone in the middle of rushing waters, showing us the shape of Ignatius's soul at its clearest. He is a bishop who longs for unity, who loves the Eucharist as life itself, who confesses Christ in real flesh and real glory, and who now desires to be joined to that Christ without delay, so that his death may become one more seed of courage in the Catholic Church he has named. The letter ends, but the offering continues in his silent steps. After the letter, there is less speech and more listening to God in the dark, and the journey begins to feel like it is moving through a narrowing corridor of time. Ignatius has given away the best of his remaining strength to the churches in words, and now what is left is to walk, to breathe, to pray, to let his body follow the path his soul has already accepted. The guards, intent on their orders, press the prisoners onward toward the coast. The landscape changes. The air tastes more and more of salt. The road slopes toward harbors where ships creak at their moorings, and where the empire's commerce never rests. For most travelers, reaching the sea would have meant anticipation, perhaps even a kind of relief. For a prisoner, it means only another stage of captivity. Yet, for Ignatius, the sea is also a threshold. Beyond it lies Italy, and beyond Italy the city where his witness will be completed. We can imagine that the crossing itself was harsh. Ancient ships were not built for comfort, and prisoners were not treated with gentleness. He may have been placed in a cramped lower space where air was stale and the movement of water rolled through the body like sickness. The sea in that region could be calm, glassy under sun, or it could be rough, slapping the hull, making even hardened sailors uneasy. We do not know whether storms rose, but even a calm crossing for an elderly man in chains would have been exhausting. The salt air dries the throat. The dampness stiffens joints. The rocking pulls at weak muscles. Yet perhaps the sea also gave him one of those quiet mercies God sometimes slips into hard journeys, the widening horizon, the sense that the world is larger than any empire, larger than any arena, larger even than the imagination of fear. A man in chains can still lift his eyes, and when he lifts them to the open water, he sees a kind of parable. The empire may control roads and ships, but it does not control the deep. God does. The sea moves under his hand, ancient and patient, and a martyr on its surface is held by the same Creator who held the apostles when they crossed waters with Christ. Once the ship reached Italy, the journey continued overland, and now the distances began to feel heavier because the end was closer. There is a peculiar fatigue that comes when a long trial is almost finished. The heart has been braced for so long that it begins to tremble not from fear, but from the strain of waiting. In such a season, even steady souls can feel a quiet loneliness. Ignatius was moving farther and farther from the churches he had met, from the affectionate faces that had gathered around him, from the rhythms of Eucharist and community that had once filled his days. Now there were more stretches of silence, the road lined with strangers, the guards less willing to allow stops. His world narrowed to steps, breath, prayer, and the dull telegraph of pain rising from joints and wounds. This narrowing could have become despair. Instead, it became contemplation. Ignatius had always known that solitude can either crush a person or open them. A fearful solitude folds inward and grows brittle. A prayerful solitude unfolds toward God and grows spacious. He chose the second. Along the Italian roads, he listened inwardly more than outwardly. The voice of soldiers, the chatter of locals, the noise of caravan wheels were all around, but his deepest hearing was turned toward Christ. We should not picture him in some dramatic trance. His spirituality was too grounded for that. Instead, think of the quiet, steady attention of someone who has lived a lifetime of prayer and now is letting prayer become as simple as breathing. Lord Jesus Christ, be with me. Lord, keep your church one. Lord, receive my life. Lord, let my death be love. Such prayers do not require eloquence. They require surrender, and he had already surrendered. It is also likely that his health began to fail more visibly. The ancient road system, though remarkable, was still hard on the body. Even free travelers fell ill from dust, cold nights, bad water. A prisoner in chains had fewer protections. Ignatius could have suffered fever, infection in the rubbed skin under iron, swelling in his legs, weakness that made each step feel like lifting stone. If so, the guards may have grown irritated, pushing him faster, cursing him for slowing them. Yet even if his body faltered, his letters suggest that his spirit was not collapsing. In fact, sometimes the weakening of the body brings a strange strengthening of the soul, not because suffering is good in itself, but because it strips away the illusion that we can save ourselves. It makes room for grace. Ignatius had long preached dependence on Christ. Now dependence was his daily bread. There is also a deeply human tenderness to consider here. As he neared Rome, he must have thought more often of those he would never see again. Antioch, of course, with its widows and children and presbyters who would now guide the flock. Smyrna and Philadelphia and the other churches that had welcomed him. Polycarp, who had held his hand in friendship, the faces of believers he had blessed on roadside evenings. Even the guards, harsh as they were, had become a part of his daily world, and he may have prayed for them too with the stubborn mercy that does not give up on anyone. To be near death is to feel memory sharpen, as if the soul gathers its loved ones into one final embrace. Ignatius likely carried them all in a quiet inner procession, offering them to God the way a priest offers bread and wine, placing them on the altar of his heart. And perhaps he also thought of Peter and Paul, the apostles whose footsteps had sanctified the Roman soil. The thought would have been both sobering and consoling. Sobering because he knew that the city that killed apostles would also kill him. Consoling because he was not walking into a lonely death. He was walking into a communion of witnesses. The church's memory is not a museum. It is a living home, and the martyrs who have gone before are not dead to the faithful. They belong to the same body. So the closer he came to the city, the more he may have felt, not in sensation but in faith, that he was being welcomed by a cloud of brothers. The Italian countryside itself would have rolled past like a quiet hymn. hills dotted with farms, vineyards in rows, little towns with shrines to pagan gods, and roads busy with soldiers and merchants. The empire at its heart was proud, confident, certain of its own permanence. But Ignatius walked through it like someone walking through a dream that will soon fade. He did not despise Rome's beauty or its achievements. He simply saw beyond them. Marble is not eternity. Power is not truth. Only Christ is. That conviction steadied him when the empire loomed largest. At some point, perhaps near a staging city outside Rome, Christians may have found a way to meet him again, even if briefly. If so, their presence would have been a last cool cup of water on a parched road. But even if no one reached him there, Ignatius was not alone. The one he had preached was with him. The Eucharist he had loved was already living in him as desire, as memory, as hope. The church he had called Catholic was walking with him in spirit, and the fear he had wrestled into submission for years was now quiet, not gone, but no longer commanding. So the final leg toward Rome is marked by thinning strength and deepening peace. The world he is leaving behind grows quieter in his mind, and the world he is entering grows clearer, not because Rome is merciful, but because Christ is near. Ignatius is tasting the nearness of death without losing peace, and that peace is itself a sermon to the church, though his mouth speaks little now. He is teaching by walking, by not running, by letting his steps be slow and faithful even as his body bends toward the ground. The sea falls behind him, and Rome rises ahead like a horizon of shadow. Rome receives him not as a man, but as a lesson to be displayed. And when the city finally rose before his tired eyes, it must have felt like stepping into the throat of the empire itself. After weeks of road dust and sea salt, the sight of Rome would have carried its own kind of weight, not only in stone and scale, but in meaning. Even from a distance, the city announced itself as something colossal, a crowned center of human power. Walls stretched long and high. Roads converged like veins toward a single heart. Aqueducts marched across the horizon on arches that seemed to defy the earth. Temples lifted their columns toward the sky, as if to say the gods of Rome owned the heavens. Crowds flowed through the gates, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, beggars, aristocrats in fine robes, slaves carrying loads, animals pushed toward market. The air was thick with smoke and shouting, and the smell of countless lives pressed together. And somewhere within that living tide, a small group of soldiers entered with prisoners, and among them an old bishop from Antioch, wrists worn by iron, shoulders bent by travel, eyes steady with a peace that did not match his chains. Rome had no reason to treat him gently. He was not on trial there in the sense of a careful hearing. His fate was already decided. He had refused to deny Christ, and in Rome that refusal was to be turned into entertainment, into warning, into spectacle. This alone tells us something of the strange cruelty of the age. The empire did not only punish, it performed punishment, using the arena as a stage to train the public in fear. The Colosseum and its circles of stone were not merely a place for sport. They were a kind of public catechism of power, teaching citizens that Rome overcame all who resisted her order. Ignatius knew this, yet he also knew another catechism, older and stronger, the catechism of the cross, in which God overcame power by love, not by violence. He walked into Rome holding that catechism close, as if the very stones of the city could not alter it. The Christians of Rome, if they knew he had arrived, would have been trembling in their hidden places. His letter had reached them earlier. They had heard his plea not to rescue him. But to hear such a plea in safety is one thing, and to face it when the man is actually in your city is another. Love is not abstract. Love becomes a storm of desire to protect. Some among them likely still searched for a way to save him, perhaps by appealing to officials, perhaps by bribing guards, perhaps by coaxing a confession out of him that might spare his life. Others, obeying his request, felt helpless, not because they lacked courage, but because courage sometimes means standing still and letting a beloved one walk into suffering. In those hidden Roman rooms, there must have been arguments murmured and prayers wept, hearts torn between the instinct to help and the humility to trust. Ignatius was not unaware of their struggle. If he learned of any rescue attempt, he would have met it with the same mixture of gratitude and firmness his letter carried. He would have known their love was real. He would not have despised it. But he would have asked again, gently and clearly, to let him be offered. For him, this was not stubbornness. It was fidelity. He had already placed his life into God's hands. To pull it back now would have been to step away from the path Christ had permitted him to walk. He loved the Roman Christians enough to free them from a love that might become fearful. He wanted their love to be wide enough to include surrender. The city itself may not have noticed him. Most citizens were busy with their own affairs, and Rome swallowed prisoners like the sea swallows stones. Yet for the small church there, his arrival was like a bell ringing in the night. It reminded them that the faith they held was not a private comfort, but a public truth, one that could cost everything. It reminded them, too, that they were part of a larger family. Ignatius, the bishop from far Antioch, had loved them without ever living among them, and now he was about to die in their city as if laying down his life on their doorstep. That kind of love enlarges a community. It makes a local church feel the pulse of the Catholic whole. We can imagine that Ignatius was held somewhere while arrangements for the games were confirmed. Perhaps he was placed in a prison near the arena, perhaps in a barracks, perhaps in a holding cell under the watch of the same guards who had escorted him. Such places were harsh, damp, crowded, and full of the sharp smell of bodies waiting for sentence. If other prisoners were there, they may have been criminals of many kinds, some frightened, some hardened, some cursing fate. Ignatius would have been an odd presence among them, not because he was soft, but because he was peaceful. Peace in a prison can look like madness to those who do not understand its source. Yet his peace was not ignorance. It was a choice of trust. At night, while Rome's streets echoed with distant revelry and the arena stood dark and silent like a sleeping beast, Ignatius likely kept vigil in his heart. His body may have been trembling from exhaustion. His stomach may have been weak from poor food. His wounds may have stung. Yet inwardly he was steady, repeating the prayers he had carried since Antioch. He was not praying now to escape death. He was praying to remain faithful in it. Lord Jesus Christ, do not let me be afraid when the hour comes. Lord, keep your church one. Lord, receive my life as a small echo of your own offering. Such prayers are simple, but they are the kind that hold a person upright when everything else is stripped away. There is also a quiet dignity in thinking of how he held his identity amid Rome's attempt to reduce him to spectacle. The empire wanted him to be a warning sign, a symbol of defeat. Ignatius refused that framing without needing to shout. He knew who he was. He was a bishop. He was a Christian. He was a member of Christ's body. Rome could call him criminal, but he belonged to a different court. Rome could chain his wrists, but it could not chain his conscience. Rome could summon beasts, but it could not alter the truth he had confessed all his life. This interior dignity is what made early martyrs so unsettling to the empire. The empire was used to breaking people by fear, but fear cannot break someone whose center is in God. And perhaps he also felt a strange tenderness for Rome itself, not for its cruelty, but for its people. A bishop's heart, even at the end, tends to pray for those around him. Rome was full of people who did not know Christ, people trapped in the same spiritual hunger that had once filled Antioch, people who cheered spectacles because they had never tasted mercy. Ignatius may have prayed for them, not as a man angry at his killers, but as a man who hoped that even his death might become a seed of faith in this city. He was walking into the arena not only for his own sanctification, but for the church's strengthening, and perhaps for the conversion of some who watched. He did not know what God would do with his blood, but he trusted that God wastes nothing offered in love. So the days or hours before the games passed in a kind of quiet tightening. Outside, Rome prepared its entertainment. Inside, Ignatius prepared his soul. The two preparations could not have been more different. One was fueled by power and appetite. The other was fueled by surrender and hope. Yet they were about to meet in the same circle of stone. Night settles over the city, and the arena waits like a mouth slightly open. The final morning comes without surprise, only with a terrible simplicity, as if the whole long road had been one slow waking into this hour. Rome stirred early, the way great cities do, and somewhere beyond prison walls people were already moving toward the amphitheater with the excitement of a day promised to them as spectacle. They came for contests, for beasts, for blood, for the thrill of seeing the empire display its dominance. Many of them did not know the name of the old man who would be placed before the animals. To them he was another prisoner, another lesson. Yet to the hidden church, and to the angels of God, this morning was something else. It was the completion of a pilgrimage. It was the flowering of a life spent guarding unity and confessing Christ. It was a quiet yes to the cross, spoken not in comfort, but in the heart of the empire that had tried to silence faith. Ignatius was led out, as he had been led for weeks, in chains, surrounded by soldiers whose faces had long since become part of his daily landscape. Perhaps they were more alert now, sensing the nearness of the arena, the public gaze, the expectation of their superiors. Perhaps they were impatient, eager to finish their duty. We do not know their mood. What we can say is that Ignatius walked. He did not drag his feet. He did not plead. He did not collapse inward. The man who had written to the Romans asking not to be rescued now lived that request with his body. His steps may have been slow, but they were consent. In a world where so much was taken from him, this consent was his last free gift. The way into the amphitheater would have been a corridor of stone, cold in shadow even if the day outside was bright. The sound of the crowd would have seeped through before he saw anything, a roar like wind in a canyon, a restless thunder of voices. Such sound can shake the bones. For prisoners it often did. Yet for Ignatius the roar was not the deepest sound in the world. The deepest sound was the voice of Christ he had learned to hear in prayer, the voice that had steadied him in Antioch and along the road, the voice that now whispered the same quiet truth. Do not be afraid. I am with you. The external noise was vast, but it could not drown the interior presence that had become his home. When he emerged into the open circle of the arena, the light would have struck him hard. The Colosseum, new enough in that era to feel like a marvel, rose around him in tears, packed with thousands of faces. From the center the world must have looked like a wall of humanity, a ring of eyes, mouths, gestures, curiosity, ridicule, and boredom all mingled. Somewhere above sat officials, perhaps even representatives of the emperor. Somewhere in the crowd, hidden among ordinary citizens, were Christians who had come to witness and to pray, their hearts shaking between grief and awe. They would have remembered his letter. They would have remembered his plea. Now they saw him in the flesh, and his lived peace would have been more convincing than any ink. Ignatius had no speech recorded here, and that is fitting. The arena was not a place for debate. It was a place where Rome wanted noise, not truth. Yet even without words, his presence spoke. A person who stands calmly before death proclaims a different kingdom. If he knelt, if he lifted his eyes to heaven, if he traced the sign of the cross in the air as countless martyrs did in those years, such gestures would have been his homily. They would have been simple, almost quiet against the roar. But simplicity is often what pierces the heart. The empire depended on fear. Ignatius offered love. Fear and love cannot occupy the same space forever without one yielding. And in that moment, Ignatius was letting fear yield. The beasts were brought out as they often were in these spectacles, hungry, stirred to aggression by keepers who knew how to provoke them. We do not need to dwell on the mechanics. The point is not the cruelty of the animals, but the cruelty of the system that used them. Ignatius faced them not as a man who believed God would magically spare him, but as a man who believed God would be with him even if he was not spared. This distinction matters. Faith is not a bargain for safety. Faith is communion with Christ, whatever comes. In his letter he had spoken of becoming wheat for Christ, ground by the teeth of beasts. Now he stood in that image, letting God complete in him what he had already accepted in spirit. We might be tempted to imagine heroism as a kind of visible triumph, a man standing tall and unflinching, as if pain were nothing. But real martyrdom is often quieter. Even saints feel the body's instinct to recoil. Even saints can tremble. What makes a martyr is not the absence of human reaction. It is the presence of a deeper yes beneath that reaction. Ignatius's yes was the slow fruit of a lifetime. It was the yes of a bishop who had fed his people the Eucharist and now wished to be fed fully by Christ. It was the yes of a shepherd who wanted his flock to remain one even after he was gone. It was the yes of a man who believed that death is not the end, but a passage into the Lord he loved. In that yes, pain became prayer. As the moment reached its completion, the crowd would have reacted in whatever way crowds react, some cheering, some turning away, some indifferent, some uneasy at the sight of a man dying without hatred. Yet the Christians who watched, hidden and weeping, were receiving something else. They were receiving an inheritance of courage. They were seeing in their brother bishop the gospel spelled in flesh. Christ had died forgiving his killers. Now Ignatius died refusing to hate, refusing to deny, refusing to be separated from the Lord. That witness would become a lamp inside them, a lamp they would carry back into their secret gatherings in Rome, into their Eucharistic prayers, into their own trials that would surely come. The empire thought it was extinguishing a leader. In truth, it was lighting many hearts. We can also imagine that word of his martyrdom traveled quickly afterward, not as rumor only, but as sacred memory. Christians spoke of it not to savor horror, but to honor fidelity. They told the churches of Asia and Syria that Ignatius had finished his race, that he had become what he longed to become, a sacrifice of love. His body was gone from sight, taken by violence, but his voice remained in letters already spreading through communities, and his spirit remained in the unity he had labored to protect. In the logic of the world, death is erasure. In the logic of the cross, death for Christ is a kind of planting. Ignatius fell into the earth like wheat, and the church would harvest courage from that falling. And perhaps, in some hidden corner of the Colosseum crowd, a heart was pricked by the sight of his peace. Perhaps someone who had come for entertainment felt a strange shame. Perhaps a soldier who had watched him for weeks felt a crack open in his conscience. We cannot say, but we know the church grew, and growth often begins in such quiet cracks. God wastes no witness offered in love. And the shepherd is gone from sight, yet not from the church he loved. What remains after beasts and silence is not a ruin, but a voice, and the life of Ignatius begins to widen after his death, the way a river widens after it leaves the mountains. In the days after the arena, the Christians of Rome returned quietly to their hidden rooms, carrying grief like a stone in the chest, yet carrying something else as well, a steadiness they had not possessed before. They had watched an old man die without hatred. They had watched him accept suffering as communion rather than as defeat. They had seen the gospel lived in a way that no sermon could rival. That memory did not fade into private sorrow. It became part of the church's bloodstream. It passed from mouth to mouth, from family to family, from city to city. And because the early church loved to keep the words of martyrs close, they preserved Ignatius's letters as carefully as they could, copying them by lamplight, reading them aloud in secret, sending them onward to communities that needed to hear a father's voice from the edge of death. The letters traveled farther than any guard could have imagined. In Ephesus, in Magnesia, in Tralles, in Philadelphia, in Smyrna, believers unfolded the scrolls and listened to their imprisoned bishop speaking as if he were in the room. His council continued to do what he had intended it to do, to bind the churches together. When fear rose, they remembered his insistence that unity is not decoration, but survival. When false teaching stirred, they remembered his clarity about Christ truly incarnate, truly suffering, truly risen. When they approached the altar, they remembered his reverence for the Eucharist as the medicine of immortality. And when persecution threatened to make them feel alone, they remembered that he had named the Church Catholic, whole and universal, not confined to one frightened city, but spread wherever Christ is confessed and his body received. In these ways, Ignatius became a bishop not only of Antioch, but of the memory and conscience of the church herself. Over time, his words shaped the church's understanding of her own structure. Ignatius had spoken often of the bishop, the presbyters, and the deacons, not as cold officials, but as a living harmony meant to reflect the unity of God. Later generations would look back and see in his letters one of the clearest windows into how the earliest Christians understood their shepherds. His vision helped the church hold fast to apostolic continuity, to the idea that faith is not invented anew in each place, but received and guarded within the communion of bishops who stand in the stream of the apostles. This was not about control for its own sake. It was about protecting the simple gospel from being reshaped by fear or pride. Ignatius's voice, forged in chains, became one of the foundations by which the church could remain the same church across centuries of change. His Eucharistic faith also became luminous for later believers. When theologians and councils would someday need to speak about the reality of Christ's presence in the sacrament, they would find in Ignatius a witness very close to the apostolic fire, a man who spoke of the Eucharist with the straightforward certainty of someone who had lived by it. He did not argue for real presence as a theory. He confessed it as life. The Eucharist, for him, was the beating heart of unity, the place where the Church becomes herself again and again. Because of this, his letters have never been merely historical documents. They are still read as spiritual food, reminders that Catholic faith is not built on cleverness, but on the humble, astonishing gift of Christ giving himself to his people. And there is his word, Catholic, so small on the page, and yet so vast in what it carried. Because Ignatius spoke it first in the way he did, the Church learned to recognize herself not as a scattered set of friendships only, but as one universal communion. When believers later spoke of the Catholic Church, they were speaking in the echo of his pastoral insight, that wherever the Eucharist is celebrated in unity with the bishop and the apostolic faith, there the Church is present in her fullness. Empires have risen and fallen since then. Borders have shifted, languages have multiplied, yet the sense of being one body across the world has remained at the core of Catholic identity. In that sense, a chained old bishop standing on a road between cities helped give generations a name for the family they already were. Ignatius also left a quieter legacy, the legacy of how to suffer without losing love. Not every Christian is called to martyrdom in the arena, but every Christian is called to carry some kind of cross, whether it is sickness, loss, misunderstanding, loneliness, or the slow weight of daily trials that do not make history books. Ignatius's life teaches that holiness is not found by escaping sorrow, but by allowing grace to transform it. He did not deny the terror of persecution. He did not pretend pain was beautiful. He simply refused to let pain make him cruel or fearful. His serenity was not numbness, it was communion. In a world still full of violence and division, that legacy is as necessary now as it was then. The Church learns again and again that the only lasting victory over suffering is to remain in Christ's love. His story also became a seed for peace in the Church's imagination. Ignatius longed for unity and harmony like a man longs for breath. He did not die clamoring for revenge. He died praying for communion. That is why his memory does not taste of bitterness. It tastes of reconciliation. When Christians venerate him, they venerate not only his courage, but his desire for oneness, his belief that to be in Christ is to be bound to one another. The bishops and theologians who read him across centuries have often been humbly corrected by that simplicity. The faithful who hear his story are reminded that the Church's strength is not in arguments won, but in love kept whole. And somewhere beneath all of these visible legacies is the more hidden one, the way Ignatius's martyrdom helped normalize the idea that Christianity is worth dying for because it is worth living for. The early Church did not seek death, but she did not fear it as a final master. Each martyr made that truth more believable. If a man can meet beasts with prayer, then death is not the last word. If a bishop can ask to be allowed to die rather than clinging to safety, then Christ must be more real than any empire. Ignatius's witness joined a chorus of early martyrs who made the resurrection feel not distant, but close, breathing through the Church like a steady wind. That wind carried her through persecutions, through heresies, through the slow centuries of growth, until what had once been hidden in Antioch and Smyrna and Rome became a faith spanning the world. So when we look back on Ignatius of Antioch, we do not see only a tragic destiny. We see a life that became a bridge between the apostles and the generations that followed. We see a shepherd who guarded a frightened flock with patience, then was torn from them with violence, then turned that violence into mission by writing letters in chains. We see the first voice to call the Church Catholic, not as a political claim, but as a recognition of a communion already alive in Christ. And we see a martyr who asked for no rescue because he trusted that love is stronger than fear, and that unity is worth any cost. So we rest tonight with Ignatius, who named the Church Catholic and walked into Christ, and we ask, how shall we walk tomorrow?